Hello and welcome to Talking Whisky. My name's Grant and today I'm going to be going through the distilling process. Don't worry, it's only going to be a short going through. So the first step is that we need to pick which grain we're going to be using, and in the example of a malted scotch, that's going to be malted barley. If we're talking about a bourbon, it's going to be a mixture of grains that's above 51% corn. So when we're talking about bourbon, that mix of grains is known as the mash bill or the mash, which is just all the grains that they're using. Now, of course, with a bourbon, that means it has to be above 51% corn. Now, when we talk about malted barley, malted means that it's a process that you do to the barley. Now, that malting process is basically you start to trick the barley to germinate. So it begins to go through the process. So it begins to kind of break down and open up sugars within the actual grains themselves. Now, during that malting process, you do want to stop it, otherwise it's going to actually sprout, and also it'll then use up all of its sugar. So you can't use it for distilling, unfortunately. So the next stage is, whether you've got your malted barley or your mash, is you're then going to mill the grain. Now, you mill the grain to break it all up to make it easier for when you start doing the fermentation. And then you take the milled grain and then you begin the fermentation period. So you add it with hot water or warm water, and then you add in yeast. Now, yeast is an amazing thing because it eats sugar and it excretes ethanol. So happy days for us. After you've done the fermentation, you then need to strain out all of your grain or all the broken up bits of grain. And then what you've got left over is known as your wash. Now, once you've got your wash, we can then start actually beginning distilling the process. Now, there are kind of two main types of stills that you can use. You can use a pot still or a column still. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm going to talk about a pot still. Now, a pot still is kind of as it sounds. Now, they're made out of copper and they will tend to have a very large base at the bottom that will then come up, and then it will go into a neck, and then it goes through a whole condensing unit to then come out as a liquid. Now, there's obviously loads of different shapes of pot stills that give different flavors depending on what you're looking for as the distiller. So for this example in this video, I'm going to go through the 2-still process. Now, there are other places in the world which use 3 stills, but we're going to go with the 2-still approach. So the first still you use is called your wash still. Then the second still you use is called your spirit still. So when you use your wash still, you take the wash that you've just fermented, you then add it into the still. You then heat up the still, and there are different methods of heating it up. You can use electricity, gas fire, or the old traditional way, which is coal fires. So you heat up the wash within the still, and that will begin to evaporate what's inside the still. It will begin to evaporate the wash. Now, alcohol will evaporate quicker than water, so you will be naturally getting more alcohol out of this wash than you would just leaving it as it is. So once you've done your entire process through your wash still and you've evaporated as much as you can, what comes out of it is usually called low wines. Now, once you've got your low wines out of your wash still, you're then going to move it into the second round of distillation in the spirit still. Now, this is where you make your cuts. Now, the cuts are called heads, hearts, and tails, or alternatively, they're called foreshots, spirits, and feints. But we're going to stick with heads, hearts, and tails for this. Now, when we say cuts, the most important cut in this whole process is known as the heart cut. That's the cut that you're going to be taking and putting in your barrel. Now, let me just quickly say cuts. Now, what I mean is, as the liquid is coming out of the still, once it's gone through the evaporation and condensing, you're then going to decide what bit you keep, and that is called a cut. You make a cut in the process. So typically, if we're talking about heads, that will kind of come off very high alcohol, and you'll have a lot of kind of light compounds going on in there. And then when you get to your tails, the alcohol really drops off, and then you start to have a lot more heavier compounds. Now, realistically, there is no set point where you make your cuts. It is up to the distiller and the distillery where they make those cuts. So when you have your entire heart cut that you're keeping to put in a barrel, sometimes you might hear, or they might have gone higher into the heads, or they might have gone lower into the tails. There are typical things that come from heads and tails, but the heart is basically what the distiller chooses they want to keep. Now, during this whole process, when you finally get to your heart cut that you then put into your barrel to then age, that only makes up about 10% of the entire wash that you made earlier in the process. Now, there is another thing to think, well, what happens to the heads and the tails? Now, most distilleries will take those heads and tails, they'll put them into the wash still again. So they'll make them go through the distilling process again to then come back into the spirit still to then do another round of cuts to decide what they're keeping. So distilleries try to reduce as much waste as they possibly can. Now, the other thing is the grain. So the grain that you used in the fermenting period, once you've siphoned all that out, a lot of distilleries tend to sell that on as animal feed, as apparently animals love malted barley grain. So that was just a really quick overview of the distilling process. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you maybe want me to go a little bit more in depth in any particular area, I'll be more than happy to. Let me know what you'd like me to talk about in the future perhaps. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and of course, cheers to you all.